So this idea then that in the war of all against all, that everything is permitted, that's quite straightforward. What am I allowed to do in order to preserve my own life? Literally anything I want. There is no restriction on my liberty of any kind. Therefore, I'm going around and I'm doing everything I possibly can in order to enhance my own self-preservation. You are also doing the same thing. So therefore, when we meet, the natural condition that emerges between us is one of mistrust, and we therefore live in a state of anxiety. As we come together and are raining blows down on each other, we recognize there's got to be a better way. There's got to be some world in which we don't have to beat each other up every time we meet people that, in fact, might be able to live in peace and harmony. The problem is, how do you get there? What's the best way to stop that kind of perpetual violence? You need someone to take the first step, right? You need someone to say, okay, I will not beat you up when I see you. What's the problem there, though? If I meet somebody on the street in this state of perpetual war, and I recognize that it's in my own self-interest not to live in a state of permanent hostility, and I say, okay, therefore, when I see Carlos, I will not beat him about the head. Instead, I will shake his hand, well, maybe not because of the virus, but I will greet him at a distance and say, hi, Carlos, how are you doing? What's my inclination for doing that? If I do that, therefore, I've made that first step. I have now created a basis for a different relationship with Carlos, not one that's based on violence and hostility, instead one that's based on peace and prosperity and even, God forbid, cooperation. What prevents me from doing that in the state of nature? Why don't I do that? Carlos sees me not beating him up. What does he think? He's a really good guy? No, he's a sucker. And then he beats me up, takes all my stuff, and he's laughing. If I engage in this action towards somebody else, which is fine, the restraint that's preventing me from doing so is my inability to have confidence that it will be reciprocated. There is no principle of reciprocity in the state of nature, and so therefore I cannot, as a matter of my own self-preservation, undertake that kind of action. And so we're left in this quandary. As reasonable beings, we recognize that living in a state of nature is suboptimal. It actually isn't good for us to have total freedom, because it goes against our own ability to preserve ourselves in the best possible way, since we're constantly struggling against other people who might take it away from us. So therefore, as a matter of self-interest, we recognize that this state of radical freedom is not actually beneficial to us. The problem then is, how do we move beyond that state of radical freedom to a better or to a different system? This is the next chapter of the first and second natural laws and of contracts. That sounds very exciting, but bear with us, because he lays out a very interesting opposition, which I think helps clarify a great deal of the Hobbesian thinking behind this project about constructing sovereignty. He says we need to distinguish between two basic ideas which are often confused as being the same thing. He says we need to distinguish between what he calls the right of nature, jus naturale, and the law of nature, lex naturalis. That jus, the right, and lex, the law, are not the same things. Natural right and natural law are often confounded, but in fact they are very, very different things. Natural right is the right to do whatever you need to do in order to preserve yourself. That is the natural rights that all living creatures are endowed with simply by virtue of their existence. There's no moral restraint. This is the freedom that we all have to do whatever we need to do in order to survive. So the world that we inhabit in the state of nature is a world of natural right. Everybody has the maximum amount of freedom to do whatever they want that they may survive. This is not natural law. Natural law actually is something very different. As he says, naturally every man has right to everything. So this is natural right. Because the condition of man is a condition of war, of everyone against everyone, in which case everyone is governed by his own reason, and there is nothing he can make use of that may not be a help unto him in preserving his life and against his enemies, it follows that in such condition every man has a right to everything, even to another's body. And therefore, as long as this natural right of every man to everything endures, there can be no security to any man, however so strong or wise he be, of living out the time which nature ordinarily allows men to live. This world of natural right condemns us to lives that are short and brutal. So therefore, what he says is the first law of nature. He says it is therefore a precept or general rule of reason, meaning people who have reason, reasonable people, what are the rules that they see? The first rule is that we should strive to live in peace. That's the first law of nature. It says every man ought to endeavor peace as far as he has hope of obtaining it. And when he cannot obtain it, that he may seek and use all helps and advantages of war. That we should seek to be peaceful, but that we should also be able to engage in conflict as needed to preserve ourselves. But reasonable people recognize that it is better for ourselves to live in peace than in war. That war is simply a necessity when peace is not possible. From this fundamental law of nature, he says, we get a second law of the second law of nature, the nature of contract and way of peace, as he puts it. A law that helps to create or cement this principle of living with each other in peace. And you will know this as the golden rule. What is the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So the first law is that reasonable people will recognize that living in peace is desirable. And the second law of nature is, the way of obtaining peace, is that you treat others as you would have them treat you. If I go and meet now Carlos on the street and I apply my second law of nature, I don't want Carlos to beat me up. Therefore, the best way to have him not beat me up is for me not to beat him up, to treat others as you would have them treat you. And so the question is, in this state of nature, how do we move from the question of, or from a state of natural right, where we have maximum freedom to do whatever we need to do in order to preserve ourselves, into a world of natural law, into a world where you would treat others as you would have them treat you, in other words, into a world of peace, from natural right to natural law. This is the fundamental transformation that Hobbes asks us to think about in the context of this thought experiment. How do we move from a state of natural right into a state of natural law? Well, we've already articulated the fundamental problem that this creates. Carlos and I are both reasonable. I don't want to pick on you, Carlos. I should pick on somebody else. But anyway, I've tried. So Carlos, thank you for playing today. So Carlos and I are both reasonable people. Therefore, as reasonable people, we have access to these fundamental laws of nature, that we both seek out peace instead of war because we recognize that it is in our self-interest, that we would treat others as we would have them treat us. And so therefore, we are equipped, we have this knowledge as part of simply being who we are, as part of our natural selves. The problem is, we cannot create a society where those become operational simply by virtue of who we are in a state of nature. Because, as I mentioned, when I meet Carlos, much as though I might wish to treat him well, that he then may treat me well, because I have no guarantee that he will do so, therefore I am pushed back into a state of war, right? That's that sense of permanent mistrust. That there is, in the interface between human interaction, this perpetual suspicion, and because of that perpetual suspicion, therefore there is perpetual hostility. In order for us to overcome this mistrust, the fact that my gesture of goodwill, of peace, may not be reciprocated, we're going to need to have something that creates a bond, or that creates an obligation between the two of us. And so, in this discussion here on contracts, the reason he calls it on contracts is he imagines that the relationships that exist between people can be summarized or expressed contractually. That when I meet somebody and I act towards them in a way that is peaceful, what I'm in effect doing is I'm engaging in a contractual behavior. I am entering into a contract with somebody that says, I am going to treat you well, and in exchange you are going to treat me well. That's essentially that law of nature, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. How do I know, though, that the terms of the contract can be enforced? That's the problem that we have. What's the enforcement mechanism? What will happen if, in fact, Carlos decides not to recognize his part of the contract? What do we do then? And this then is what prevents us from moving in the state of natural right to a state of natural law. That a world of natural law is a world of contract, defined then by contractual obligation, in which people interact with each other based on what he calls covenants, based on the obligation to provide to provide something. The problem is, how do we enforce the terms of the covenant? Well, you're going to need something between here, right? You're going to need something that lies between this world of natural right and this world of natural law. You're going to need some element that allows you to give up radical freedom that you have here and instead enter into a contractual basis for relationships. And this line, what you need here is civil society. You need to have a political solution. Politics moves us from the world of natural right to natural law. But not just any kind of politics. We need a certain kind of politics that will be compelling enough to allow us to enter into these contracts in a meaningful way. And so what Hobbes imagines as part of this thought experiment is, where does this come from? How do we draw this line? How do we define the state in this way? What's actually going on? In order that we may come together in peaceful terms and not commit acts of violence or live in a state of perpetual anxiety, in order for that covenant to be honored, I have to, as a radically free and equal individual, I have to be willing to give up my rights. I have to be willing to give up the right to do whatever I want in order to preserve my own life. Because if I hold on to that right, if I hold on to the right to do whatever I want in order to achieve self-preservation, I recognize as a reasonable person that my life is going to be nasty, brutish, solitary, and poor and short. That I don't want. So therefore, I want to move into this world of natural law. To get there, I need to give up what's preventing me from getting there, namely all of these rights and freedoms that I have. That only makes sense if the people I meet have also given up that right. So it's not just me, but it's everybody in the society. So when I meet somebody, I can now treat them with a degree of confidence that otherwise I would not have, because I know that not only have I been stripped of my natural rights, but you've been stripped of your natural rights as well, which means we no longer have the right to attack or kill or engage in whatever violence we need to in order to preserve ourselves. To whom do we give up those rights? For Hobbes, that is the state. The state the state exists as a function of the repudiation of your own sovereignty, and it is the sovereign or the state that then takes up your sovereignty and acts essentially in your name. This line comes from you. It's created as a function of your own autonomy and your own sovereignty as a free individual. And the reason you are willing to give up your freedom is not because you are being coerced into doing so. It's not because God wants you to give up your freedom. It's because you are a reasonable, rational human being. You have access by virtue of your reason to nature's first and second law, that it is better to live in peace than war, and that we should live according to the principles of do unto others as you would have them do unto you. All reasonable people can accept those natural laws. Therefore, in order to achieve it, reasonable people will renounce or repudiate their own sovereignty in order to achieve those laws, right? In order for those laws to be able to come into effect. And so we can move into a world of natural law away from a world of natural right precisely by relocating the sovereignty of the individual that we have naturally into an artificial person who we then construct, who is not natural. All people recognize it is better to live in peace than war, and that it is a good idea to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The war of all against all is not because we're naturally inclined to violence, not because we're unjust. There's no such thing. It's because we act for self-preservation. That's a rational thing to do. But it is also rational to recognize that that's suboptimal for the kind of lives that we want to live. Therefore, reasonable people will seek to move to a better place. It is a reasonable thing to want to move away from natural right to move to natural law. All reasonable people can agree on that. We have a certain sovereignty that attaches to us simply by virtue of our nature. The state then comes out of this act in which we move our sovereignty into the hands of the state.
But that's something natural.
Sorry, that's artificial. The state is then a construct that's made out of all of us doing that. That's the artificial man. Reasonable people will want to create this kind of model of sovereignty.
So is done by nature.
In the sense that our reason is natural, yes. But the point about the state is that it has to be constructed in this way. I mean, let's be clear. If you are living in a state which is based on like the divine principle or the principle of divine kingship, for Hobbes, that's not a meaningful form of sovereignty, because that's making a claim of power that's transcendental that people can then disagree with. So that's for him, that's not a reasonable basis for sovereignty. So for Hobbes, instead, what you want to do is you want to construct a state in such a way that everybody can recognize the basis for the sovereignty that's concentrated in the state. That is, yes, you're right, it comes out of the natural use of reason, but it requires an artificial mechanism. That's the point about the state. It's not, if we go back to Aristotle, remember that the idea of the state is, because politics happens naturally between all of us, the state is simply an extension of that kind of naturally existing relationship. For Hobbes, that's not the case. What happens when we meet is we are locked into this state of perpetual war. Therefore, politics is an artificial construct to rescue us from our natural condition. Politics is what we need to escape nature, not what happens in nature. And the way we can escape it is by essentially recognizing that in order to live in a world of natural law, which is guided then by a system of covenants, guarantees, we need someone to be the guarantor. We need someone to hold power over us, so that if I violate the terms of the contract, I will be punished, and therefore I will have an incentive to honor the terms of the contract, and thus know that other people have that same incentive as well. And once I know that that's in place, then I have the possibility to live in peace and harmony with my neighbors. But the point about it is that it's predicated on the rational action of an individual person who freely gives up her own sovereignty because she recognizes it as being in her own self-interest. The model of power that he comes up with looks an awful lot like the model of kingship that he's replacing. So instead of a king, now you have a Leviathan. What's the difference, right? You have one person who essentially wields absolute authority, and nobody has really the capacity to say anything about it. There's no constitutional assembly, there's no democratic elections, power concentrated in the hands of one person. So really, what have we done, right? We've gone from a model of kingship to a different model of kingship. But the interesting thing is, and this is the purpose, this is the point of it, is he wants us to think about a better basis upon which that sovereignty is drawn. If you're a reasonable person and you read this book, you will recognize that the kingship that we have over us exists by virtue of the sovereignty that you as an individual have. That you've renounced that sovereignty and placed it into the hands of the state, that you may then lead a better life. And so rational, self-interested individuals will therefore have an incentive in maintaining the stability of the state, because essentially it is in their own interest to do so. By relocating the basis of sovereignty from above, some transcendental claim, to below, to the individual herself, at that point then you've given people a reason to be, if you will, participant to the state, to the structure of the state. That's the argument that he's trying to make. So it's as if to say, you've all lived inside this social contract, you just haven't recognized it. Now I'm going to write this book, and once you read it, you'll be like, yeah, of course, right? That's essentially the argument that's here. So it's not like he imagined that there's going to be some big convention and we're all going to come walking out of the state of nature and like give away our sovereignty and so on. That's not what he's suggesting is going on. Instead, he's saying the world that we live in, this is why it looks the way it does. And all this other stuff, claims to universal, claims to divine kingship and stuff like this, that's all artificial convention and construct. What instead is happening is that the state is an artificial person who's created out of the natural bodies of all the citizens inside of the state. For Hobbes, to rescue ourselves from the world of natural right and instead allow us to live in a world of natural law, he says we need to introduce the element of fear. We have to make people afraid. And the fear is therefore reflected as power over us, power to punish us should we transgress. And that power is concentrated then in the hands of the state. We give up our own right to violence, and we instead place that power into the hands of the state itself, and therefore the state has that power over us. And we grant to the state the exclusive use of power, that only the state, therefore, may exercise power over us. And you probably know this through the phrase, the monopoly of violence. Hobbes would argue that it is always a reasonable act for you to give up the rights that you have that you may live in a civil society. That reasonable people will not want to live in a world of natural right. It goes against your own self-interest. The mechanism of the contract is not an active one. The idea is that we create civil societies by virtue of being reasonable people, but what's anchoring those civil societies is this sort of contractarianism. The infant may not yet be capable of making rational judgment, but as soon as he is capable of making rational judgment, this is the kind of solution that, this is the reason that he will end up living in a civil society, because that's what rational people do. For Hobbes, the construction of the state, or the existence, I should say, of the state, is postulated based on the equality, freedom, and sovereignty of the individual. The state comes from us. It's not something that's imposed over us. We are the sovereignty of the state. And the fact that the state exercises this sovereign power over us is actually a reflection of our own sovereignty, simply handed over to this guarantor, to the state. So by the time we get to the end of Book 1, what we end up with is this idea then that a lot of what we have around us, a lot of the forms of power that we have around us, and our ideas of sovereignty that we've inherited, are wrong. They are not, in fact, well expressed. They're not legitimate. They're not reasonably deduced. So for Hobbes, the whole point of this first book is to lay out a better way of understanding why the state exists. Civil society exists as a matter of self-preservation in a way that is optimal for the individuals who are thereby self-preserving. It doesn't exist as a function of divine creation. It's not something that springs naturally between people. Instead, it is something that we create as a function of our reason. Reasonable people are willing to renounce their sovereignty in order that they may move from a world of natural right into a world of natural law. We recognize, therefore, in our own nature that because we must be mistrustful of others, it is therefore to our advantage to create this powerful structure above us, to enforce the covenants, to enforce the contracts that implicitly exist between us in our society. And from there we get this idea of a contract that is at the foundation of our capacity to live as social animals, hence the idea of a social contract. That's the Hobbesian innovation, the idea of a social contract. That civil society, the political society, is premised on the permeation of this social contract that exists between all people, and the state exists in order to enforce the terms of the social contract. Once you remove the state, and there is no basis for enforcing the social contract, then we fall into anarchy. So the question that was raised, is this simply a utopian vision? I think for Hobbes the answer is it's not a utopian vision, because look at what happened in his own lifetime. England fell into civil war, there was deprivation, death, famine, and so on. When you live outside of the state, you recognize that you need the state in order to preserve order. And if you think about it in our own day, look at people who've lived in who have experienced the collapse of the state around them, people living in Syria or Libya or Iraq, for example. What does life look like once you get rid of the dictatorships that exist above people? Does life get better? No. No. Saddam Hussein may have been a brutal dictator, but by toppling him without putting any replacement structure, all that happened was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died prematurely. Their life started to look like, exactly as Hobbes says, nasty, poor, solitary, brutish, and short. When you're living in that circumstance, sure, dictatorship sounds pretty nasty, but what's the alternative? Outright civil war in which everybody is locked into a conflict of one man with every other man. Therefore, at that point, you're starting to think, maybe having a structure of authority might be a better way to go. This is the kind of mindset that Hobbes wants us to recognize. And therefore, it is a reasonable act to incline towards those modes of authority, whatever they may be. Now, when we'll come back next time, we'll see that the model of government that Hobbes argues is necessary, we will probably disagree with. Because he suggests that in order for this covenant, in order for this for this contract to be enforced, it's not enough simply to have some kind of political model above us. Instead, he argues that that political model must be absolute in the authority that it exercises over us, to an extent to which I think many of us would be made uncomfortable. But in fact, as we'll see, there's a reason for why Hobbes argues that we need to have this kind of strong structure. And so when we come back next week, we'll take our final look at Hobbes and consider the powers that he wants to invest in the state, why he wants to do it. And then the question I'll ask you to think about this in the intervening period, which is, given this mode of power that Hobbes elaborates for us, do you see for yourselves, or going forward, opportunities or a necessity, perhaps, of a kind of Hobbesian political authority in the future? So we'll consider that question when we come back next time.